The vast intergalactic courtroom pulsed with an eerie, bioluminescent glow, casting long, shifting shadows across its brutalist architecture. Towering spires of dark metal loomed overhead, giving the chamber a cavernous, oppressive feel. The Varnak, a reptilian race known for their ruthless efficiency and sadistic rule over conquered species, had built their judicial halls to make the accused feel insignificant. Yet, despite the overwhelming size and sheer alien grandeur of the place, the lone human standing at the center of the room didn't look the least bit intimidated. If anything, he looked bored. James Carter stood with his hands cuffed in front of him, his posture relaxed, weight shifted slightly onto one leg as if he were leaning against an invisible bar counter. His unruly dark hair was matted with dirt, and his jumpsuit, standard issue for prisoners of war, was slightly torn at the shoulder. But his expression, that maddeningly calm smirk, was what truly set him apart from the countless prisoners who had stood here before. The High Judge, a hulking Varnak draped in ceremonial black armor, tapped his clawed fingers impatiently against the armrest of his throne-like seat. His eyes, slitted and burning with golden light, narrowed. "James Carter," he intoned, his voice a guttural rasp that echoed through the chamber. "You stand accused of crimes against the Varnak Dominion. The list is long, and the verdict is, well, you know how this ends." James let out an exaggerated yawn. "Sorry, I must have dozed off. You were saying something about a list?" Murmurs rippled through the audience, a mix of Varnak warriors, high-ranking officials, and a few unfortunate human captives forced to watch. Some of the younger Varnak soldiers snickered under their breath before quickly composing themselves. The High Judge's claws flexed against the armrest, leaving deep gouges in the metal. "You dare mock this court?" James tilted his head as if considering it. "That depends. Is this actually a court? Because it looks more like a really bad reality show where you execute people for fun." The judge's nostrils flared. "Your crimes are not in dispute. The sabotage of Dominion warships, the incitement of rebellion, the destruction of supply routes." James held up a finger, still shackled. "That last one wasn't me." "Well, mostly. I just suggested the explosives go there instead of there." The judge growled, his patience wearing thin. "Enough. You are guilty. The sentence is death. Your execution will be broadcast across the conquered sectors as a warning to others who would defy us." James let the silence hang for a moment before exhaling through his nose, as if genuinely disappointed. "Man, and here I was hoping for a fair trial. Guess that was a little optimistic." The judge sneered, leaning forward. "You act as if you have a choice in this matter." James finally lifted his eyes to meet the judge's gaze directly. His smirk didn't waver, but something about the way he stood a little straighter, the way his expression darkened just slightly, sent a ripple of unease through the room. "You really don't know who I am, do you?" For a moment, there was silence. Then laughter. It started with the judge, a deep, throaty rumble, and soon the other executioners joined in, their guttural voices filling the chamber. Some of the spectators chuckled as well, taking their cues from the Varnak elite. One of the executioners, a leaner Varnak with a jagged scar down his snout, shook his head. "This is amusing. You think your name carries weight?" Another grinned, baring razor-sharp teeth. "We have executed thousands of your kind. Do you believe yourself special?" James didn't answer right away. He let them enjoy their laughter, let them believe they were in control for just a few moments longer. Then, just as the laughter was beginning to subside, he took a slow step forward, his shackles clinking softly in the otherwise silent room. "If I were you," he said, his voice smooth, almost casual, "I'd be laughing too." The judge leaned in slightly. "Oh? And why is that?" James smiled wider. "Because in about 5 minutes, you're going to wish you'd killed me the second I walked in here." A murmur spread through the gathered audience like a slow-moving wave, the laughter of the executioners fading into an uneasy quiet. Among the spectators there were more than just Varnak warriors. Humans, enslaved laborers and rebel prisoners, stood in rusted cages along the periphery, forced to witness the spectacle of their supposed champion's demise. There were others, too, A handful of traitors from neutral worlds, spies pretending to be uninterested, and even a few high-ranking mercenaries who had long sold their services to the Dominion. It was one of these mercenaries, an old, grizzled alien with scarred blue-gray skin and a missing tusk, who reacted first. His yellow eyes widened slightly, and his clawed hand tightened around the metal railing in front of him. He turned to his companion, a reptilian smuggler draped in tattered cloth, and hissed, "Did he say his name was Carter?" The smuggler frowned. "Yeah. What about it?" The old alien exhaled sharply. "Not just any Carter. James Carter." The smuggler scoffed. "Never heard of him." "You have now." The mercenary's voice dropped into a near whisper. "The man who destroyed Zephyr 7. The one who tricked an entire Varnak fleet into firing on their own ships. The strategist behind the Blackout Revolt." Now the smuggler's eyes widened. "That's a myth." The mercenary shook his head. "You think so? Tell me, have you ever seen a Varnak go pale?" The smuggler turned back toward the execution platform, his gaze settling on the group of heavily armored warriors surrounding the High Judge. He had seen Varnak in battle, had watched them tear through squads of soldiers without hesitation. Yet, standing there, some of them stiffened ever so slightly, their tails twitching involuntarily. And then he saw it, the younger ones whispering among themselves, glancing at the High Judge as if waiting for him to confirm something. The judge himself remained unmoving, though his golden eyes flickered with something new. Not anger. Not amusement. Something closer to wariness. One of the junior officers, a scrawny Varnak barely out of adolescence, hesitated before cautiously tapping at the small holopad built into his gauntlet. The screen flickered as he ran a search query through the Dominion's war archives. The moment the results loaded, the color drained from his face. The officer took a sharp step back. "Sir?" His voice cracked. He swallowed, trying again. "Sir, we have a problem." The High Judge didn't look away from James. "What problem?" The officer's scaled fingers tightened around his holopad. "James Carter isn't just a rebel. He's that Carter." The judge's jaw clenched, but he didn't let his expression falter. "Impossible." The officer's hands trembled slightly as he turned the screen toward his superior. "It's him, sir. Confirmed records. Classified records." The High Judge barely glanced at the display before slamming his clawed fist against the armrest of his throne. The impact sent a tremor through the metal floor beneath them. The officer flinched, but James only raised an eyebrow. "I see my reputation precedes me," James said dryly. The judge exhaled slowly, measuring his response. "We killed Carter 2 years ago." James smirked. "Well, that was your first mistake." The executioners who had been laughing moments ago now shifted uncomfortably, their confidence cracking. Some of them had been on the front lines. They had fought against rebels, hunted insurgents, and quelled uprisings. They had heard stories of human resistance fighters, most of them easily crushed. But James Carter? James Carter wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a spy or a warrior in the traditional sense. He was something far worse, a tactician, a strategist, a man who didn't just fight battles, he ended them before they began. The High Judge straightened, regaining his composure. "If you think your reputation will save you, you are mistaken." James chuckled, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off a mild inconvenience. "Reputation? No. But reality might." One of the older executioners, a battle-hardened warrior with a deep scar across his snout, took a cautious step forward. His clawed hand hovered over the hilt of his blade. "If you are truly Carter," he said slowly, "then why allow yourself to be captured?" James smiled, but there was no humor in it. Only certainty. "Because I wanted to be here." A ripple of unease passed through the executioners. The audience, once entertained, now watched with quiet intensity. Even the enslaved humans, who had initially looked resigned to witnessing another futile act of rebellion, seemed to sense that something had shifted. The High Judge narrowed his eyes. "You're bluffing." James tilted his head. "Am I?" At that moment, the lights in the chamber flickered. Once. twice. A low hum vibrated through the floor, subtle but unmistakable. The High Judge's eyes darted to his guards. "Check the power grid." One of the executioners pressed a button on his gauntlet. "Control, report status." "Static." The guard tried again. "Control, do you read?" Silence. James exhaled, almost sympathetically. "You should probably worry less about me and more about what's coming next." The executioners stiffened. The judge's claws tapped against the armrest, his mind working through the possibilities. James turned slightly, casting a glance toward the cages lining the chamber. The humans inside weren't trembling in fear anymore. Some of them had their hands clenched into fists. A few even looked hopeful. The smuggler in the audience swallowed hard. "Something's happening." The old mercenary nodded. "Oh, yes." He turned his gaze back to James Carter, who now stood a little taller, his smirk fading into something more dangerous. "Something is definitely happening." The lights flickered one last time. And then, the alarms began to scream. The lights flickered again, this time more violently, casting jagged shadows across the chamber. The execution platform trembled as a deep, distant rumble vibrated through the metal floors. The sound wasn't random. It wasn't a malfunction. It was planned. James Carter barely moved. He didn't need to. He had seen this play out in his head 100 times. The judge, the executioners, the guards, none of them realized yet that the moment they captured him, their fate had been sealed. The High Judge's gaze snapped toward his officers. "Report!" One of the guards frantically tapped at his communicator, his tail thrashing in agitation. "Control room is unresponsive. All external channels are dead." The High Judge stood, his imposing figure framed by the towering throne behind him. "Lock down the chamber. No one leaves." James exhaled through his nose. "Wrong move." Before the judge could react, the first explosion hit. The blast came from somewhere deep beneath the execution chamber, sending a shudder through the ground. Dust and metal fragments rained from above, and the once imposing structure groaned under the sudden impact. The guards spun toward the source of the noise, weapons drawn. The crowd erupted into chaos. Mercenaries bolted toward the exits, traitors ducked for cover, and the enslaved humans in their cages clutched the bars, eyes wide with a mix of fear and hope. James remained exactly where he was, shackled but completely unconcerned. The High Judge turned to the nearest executioner. "Find out what's happening." A second explosion. This one closer. One of the younger Varnak officers nearly dropped his weapon. "Sir, we—" And then, the lights cut out entirely. For the briefest moment, the chamber was plunged into total darkness. The only sound was the distant hum of failing energy systems and the erratic breathing of panicked guards. Then, in the pitch black, came the first gunshot. A single, precise shot echoed through the chamber, followed by the unmistakable thud of a body hitting the floor. Then another. And another. The Varnak guards, disoriented, roared in confusion, their night vision struggling to adjust to the sudden shift. They fired wildly, their plasma rifles illuminating the darkness in short bursts of electric blue. It was a mistake. James had handpicked his people for this. They didn't charge in recklessly. They moved like ghosts, slipping through the shadows, striking with quiet efficiency. Suppressed gunfire whispered through the chamber, and each shot meant another Varnak dropping before they could even register what was happening. The High Judge's fury boiled over. "Enough of this!" He slammed a clawed fist against the emergency controls on his throne, flooding the room with backup lighting. For a split second, the battlefield was visible. The once orderly execution chamber was now a war zone. Rebel operatives, disguised among the enslaved prisoners and spectators, had overpowered several guards and taken their weapons. Explosions had breached the lower levels, allowing even more of James' forces to pour in. The Varnak executioners, some of the most feared warriors in the Dominion, were scattered and outmaneuvered. And at the center of it all, still standing calmly on the execution platform, was James Carter. With the lights back on, the guards turned toward him, weapons raised. James smiled. "Took you long enough." Before they could react, he lifted his shackled hands, and the cuffs clicked open. A guard hesitated. How? James didn't give him time to finish the question. In one swift movement, he yanked the plasma rifle from the nearest guard's grip and drove an elbow into his throat. The Varnak choked, stumbling back just as James spun the rifle around and fired 3 rapid shots into the executioners closest to him. The rebels saw their opening. Gunfire erupted across the chamber as James' forces pushed forward, cutting through the remaining guards. The enslaved humans, some of whom had been waiting for this moment for years, joined the fight, grabbing weapons from fallen executioners and throwing themselves into the fray with desperate determination. James ducked behind a fallen column, reloading his stolen rifle. A familiar voice crackled in his earpiece. "Boss, we're in." James pressed a hand to his ear. "Status?" Lucy's voice came through, sharp and focused. "Powers disabled across all security sectors. Outer gates are compromised. We have full control of the lower armory." James peered over the rubble, watching as his people tore through the remaining Varnak forces. The High Judge, now visibly furious, had drawn a massive blade from his belt and was cutting through rebels with terrifying precision. But it was too late. His empire's grip on this place was already slipping. "Good," James said into his calm. "Get the ships ready. We're not sticking around for the after-party." Lucy hesitated. "You sure you don't want to kill the judge first?" James glanced toward the High Judge, who was still carving his way through the fight, his golden eyes locked onto James like a predator. "Tempting," James admitted. "But not today." He tapped his earpiece, switching channels. "All units, fall back to the extraction point." The rebels began moving, shifting from all-out combat to a controlled retreat. They had what they came for. The execution had turned into a battle, and the battle had turned into a symbol. Across the galaxy, this moment was being broadcast. Humans everywhere would see it. And that was worth more than any dead Varnak judge. James sprinted toward the exit as the final charges detonated, collapsing part of the chamber behind him. The High Judge roared in frustration, watching his prize slip through his claws. As James reached the stolen Varnak warship waiting for him, Lucy met him at the ramp. She grinned, tossing him a fresh sidearm. "Think they're still laughing?" James holstered the weapon and smirked. "Not anymore." The ship lifted off, disappearing into the darkness of space, leaving the shattered execution chamber behind. The Varnak warship trembled as it cut through the planet's upper atmosphere, its hull glowing red from the friction of a high-speed ascent. Inside, James Carter stood at the ship's tactical console, hands steady as he watched the battle unfolding below. The prison compound, once an impenetrable fortress, was now a raging inferno, smoke and debris rising into the darkened sky. Explosions rippled through its outer walls, the last remnants of his team Sabotage ensuring that the Varnak wouldn't reclaim it any time soon. Lucy stood beside him, her fingers flying across the ship's control panel. "All right, boss, we're officially in the clear." "No pursuit yet." James barely reacted. He was watching the surface of the planet with careful intensity, tracking the movement of rebel forces still engaged in battle. While he and his closest operatives had secured their escape, hundreds of freed prisoners and resistance fighters were still locked in combat below. "The judge isn't running," James noted, his voice laced with something close to admiration. Lucy snorted. "Yeah, well, he's an idiot." Down on the battlefield, the High Judge stood atop the remains of a collapsed watchtower, his massive blade dripping with fresh blood. He was surrounded by the bodies of his own fallen guards and a dozen rebels he had cut down personally. Despite being vastly outnumbered, he refused to retreat. Instead, he fought harder, his golden eyes filled with seething rage. James knew the type. The ones who couldn't accept defeat. The ones who would rather die fighting than admit they had been outplayed. Lucy tapped a few buttons, bringing up a live battlefield feed. "You want to drop a little something on his head before we go?" James considered it. A well-placed missile, a precision strike, and the High Judge would be nothing more than a charred memory. But no. Not yet. James smirked. "Let him live." Lucy raised an eyebrow. You sure? James leaned back against the console, arms crossed. The Varnak need to see him lose. Killing him now makes him a martyr. Let him crawl back to his superiors, humiliated and broken. That'll hurt more. Lucy grinned. Damn, you're cold. James gave a small shrug. Just practical. Below, the battle raged on, but the tide had shifted. The rebels weren't just fighting anymore, they were winning. Varnak forces were in full retreat, their once unshakable ranks crumbling under the sheer momentum of the uprising. And the galaxy was watching. The execution that was meant to crush human spirits had become a rallying cry. Every second of this was still being broadcast across countless systems, into every occupied world where humans and other subjugated species lived under Varnak rule. James could already imagine it. Somewhere, on a distant mining colony, an enslaved worker was watching and realizing, for the first time in years, that the Varnak weren't invincible. On another planet, resistance cells that had been too afraid to act were now picking up their weapons. The war had just changed. The High Judge, still standing on the battlefield, finally seemed to realize the same thing. His blade lowered slightly, his eyes scanning the carnage around him. The Varnak were losing. And James Carter had made sure the whole universe knew it. On board the warship, alarms blared as the ship's long-range scanners picked up something new. Lucy checked the readings, her grin disappearing. Boss? We've got incoming. James turned to the screen. His eyes narrowed as several Varnak capital ships appeared on the sensors, dropping out of hyperspace just beyond the planet's orbit. Reinforcements. A lot of them. Damn, Lucy muttered. Guess they were paying attention. James didn't hesitate. Get us out of here. Now. Lucy's fingers danced over the controls, punching in coordinates. The warship's engines roared as the ship banked hard, angling toward deep space. The massive Varnak capital ships locked onto them almost immediately, their heavy cannons charging. The first blast tore through the vacuum just behind them, missing their ship by a fraction. The second came closer, forcing Lucy to jerk the controls, sending them into a spiraling evasive maneuver. Anytime now, Lucy. Working on it. The Varnak ships continued their barrage, but James wasn't worried. They had expected this. In fact, they were counting on it. As the warship shot forward, two more vessels suddenly decloaked alongside them, smaller, more agile fighters piloted by rebel allies. They immediately engaged the Varnak capital ships, unleashing a flurry of missiles and laser fire that forced the larger vessels to divert their focus. Lucy grinned. Gotta love backup. James didn't react. He was already looking ahead, at the endless stretch of stars in front of them. Jump coordinates locked. Locked. Then take us home. Lucy slammed her hand down on the console. The ship's engines flared with brilliant white light, and in the blink of an eye, they vanished into hyperspace, leaving the Varnak fleet behind. The battle was over. But the war was just beginning. Across the galaxy, millions of screens flickered with the same broadcast. The execution of James Carter had not gone as planned. Instead of a public display of Dominion dominance, the Varnak had unwittingly delivered a spectacle of their own humiliation. The once feared executioners had been outmaneuvered, their impenetrable fortress reduced to rubble, their High Judge left standing in the wreckage, bloodied and defeated. The transmission, originally meant to demoralize, had done the opposite. On countless worlds where humans and other oppressed species toiled under the Varnak's rule, the name James Carter spread like wildfire. On a desolate mining colony, a gaunt worker with dust-caked skin stared at the flickering screen in his barracks. The moment James' face appeared, smirking, alive, victorious, he exhaled a slow, shaky breath. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe. In the neon-lit depths of a black market station, a group of mercenaries watched the broadcast in silence. When the final shot showed the Varnak fleet arriving too late to stop Carter's escape, one of them muttered, "Hells, I'd take a contract from that guy." In the command room of an underground resistance cell, a grizzled veteran slammed his fist onto the table, his voice trembling with excitement. "We're back in this fight. Everywhere, the same realization took hold. The Varnock weren't untouchable. And James Carter had proven it. Aboard the stolen warship, James leaned back against the cold metal of the command room, arms crossed as he watched the final moments of the broadcast play on a small screen. He knew what it meant. The battle had been about more than escaping execution. It had been about proving that rebellion wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. Lucy strolled in, stretching her arms above her head. So, I'm thinking we are not dying to today's list of accomplishments. James smirked. I like to keep things exciting. Lucy flopped into a chair and propped her boots up on the console. You think the Varnock are panicking yet? James exhaled through his nose. Oh, they're doing more than panicking. They're planning their next move. Lucy frowned. Yeah, well, so are we, right? James didn't answer right away. Instead, he tapped a command into the console, pulling up a map of the known galaxy. Red markers lit up across dozens of systems, occupied worlds, prison colonies, military outposts. But among them were growing clusters of green, resistance strongholds, hidden bases, entire planets where the Varnock's control was beginning to slip. We need to be smart, he said finally. The Varnock are going to hit back. Hard. We can't just keep fighting from the shadows. We need more people, more ships, more allies. Lucy nodded slowly. You're talking full-scale war. James met her gaze. We just started one. The stolen warship drifted through the quiet of deep space, its engines humming softly. The crew was small, too small to fight a war alone. But James had never planned to fight alone. Recruits would come. Supplies would be gathered. Allies, some expected, some not, would join the cause. The Dominion would rally their forces, but for the first time in centuries, they were on the defensive. The war had begun. Somewhere, on a distant Varnock-controlled world, a frightened governor was already preparing a new list of most wanted rebels. And at the very top of that list, in bold crimson letters, was a name that the Dominion would come to fear more than any other. James Carter. And this was only the beginning.